Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another great webinar from cpaacademy.org. My name is Beryl, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar, D&I One-on-One, a Year in Preview. I've got our presenter, Jina Etienne, here, and we'll turn things over to her in just a minute. But before we get started, I want to go through some housekeeping items and do some quick technical checks to make sure everything is working. First of all, if you don't mind going to the GoToWebinars Questions tab on your control panel, letting me know you can hear my voice and see our title slide. Feel free to let me know what city you're listening in from as well. I always love seeing where in the world you are tuning in from today. Now, if anyone has any technical trouble during the webinar, please let me know in that questions panel. Keep in mind there are quite a few of you here, and I'll do my best to get around to each of you as quickly as I can. This is also where you can put any questions or comments you have today for our presenter as well. All right, let me check in on that questions panel, see where you all are tuning in from. I did see we have John Lugo tuning in from Puerto Rico. Hello, John. Hello, William in Michigan. We've got St. Louis, Missouri, Atlanta, Seattle, Washington, Danville, Virginia. I'm tuning in from Virginia as well. Let's see here. All good in South Carolina, Brooklyn, New York. Excellent. All right. Now that I know everything is working, let's go through some housekeeping. This webinar qualifies for 1 CPE credit. The way you earn that credit today is fairly straightforward. Just stay logged in for 50 minutes of our webinar and answer the poll questions. We'll have a total number of 4 polls during today's session, and to earn full credit, you'll need to answer at least 3 of them. Now, if you're on a mobile device, you might need to click your answer a few times and scroll down to find the submit button. And if you have to log out and log back in for any reason at all, our system will keep track of your time. I wanted to let you know we are recording today's webinar, and the archive, along with your CPE credit, will be available in your CPA Academy account within 24 hours. We also do recommend that you download today's presentation materials, which can be found in the Control Panel's Handouts tab. All right, I think that is all from me. Now that we are all set, let me turn the floor over to our presenter. Jina, the floor is all yours.
Okay, sorry, I muted myself and now I'm unmuted. Hello, everyone. It is 2022. I'm excited to be back. I was actually looking at the locations as they were being read out, and I saw Maryland. Yay, Erin is near me. I'm in Maryland. I'm on the East Coast. I see somebody in Toronto, and I just felt cold all of a sudden, this shiver come over me, just because I think it's cold there, but what do I know? Anyway, thank you all for joining me. For those who've been around, and attended, this is a series that goes every other Friday. It's usually at 3 o'clock Eastern. And so for the rest of the year, it will be happening at 3 o'clock every other Friday. And the goal of this webinar series is usually I have a guest on, and what I do is talk with that guest on one topic. And it's really about understanding different perspectives, different approaches, different issues, definitions of things. There's a lot of different things we cover. It's really not intended to be a formal presentation, but really an exploration. Now, having said that, it's me, myself, and I today. And the goal of today's session is really to look forward into 2022, to share what are some of the trends or some of the things that we might expect to see happening in 2022 in the D&I space. But I also want to hear from you. What has been your experience? What are some of the topics you're interested in? Is there a question you have and you haven't been able to get it answered anywhere else? Or have you heard conflicting answers and you'd like to get some clarity? And I'm not suggesting I have the answers, but I love the opportunity to explore new and different questions. You know, I'm thinking about a Rubik's Cube. Okay, that's probably a bad example, but something where you can look at the same thing from multiple perspectives to get a deeper understanding. That's the goal. So thank you for joining me. And so I have a slide presentation. I might be jumping around on the slides. I'm happy to pause at any given time, depending on the questions that are coming in. And I'm going to be asking you all today in the polling questions some feedback to help me in terms of guiding the conversation. So I'm also going to be monitoring the Q&A. So you'll see my eyes darting around a bit. The Q&A is down here in front of me. My slides are over there, and I have notes over there. Lastly, because it's just me, maybe I should be, I might be talking to myself a little bit to do the I'm the guest and then I'm the host thing. Let's hope that that doesn't happen too much. So let's start with the year in preview. And by that, I mean, what's coming up, what's happening. So I have a list of topics that you can see here on the screen. And none of these topics are intended to be prescriptive. I'm not predicting the future, but we've been working on D&I in the accounting industry for years, for decades. And so much of our efforts up until 2020 were really focused on diversity in the sense of creating opportunities for different groups to join the profession, to see an increase in representation from different groups as employees and staff in the accounting profession. But a lot of the efforts then that talked about promotion, where we thought about equity, where we talked about development, many of those initiatives were focused on women. And so when we even say gender, today we know gender has a broader meaning, but they were typically focused on, women in partnership, women in the C-suite. These are important conversations. But now we know that moving forward since 2020, the topics have exploded. So you see all of these things here. For example, differentiating DIEB. Diversity and inclusion has taken on this term of its own. The two words together get kind of lumped in as a single thing. But let's break it down. What are those elements? Because each element requires some attention. Making it happen, and what I mean here is strategy. So we are committed to diversity and inclusion. We understand that this is important. So now what do we do? Well, let's talk about how do you make it happen. And there's ways to work on this, whether you're a sole practitioner or whether you're the Fortune 500. Now, I'm going to guess that if you're in the Fortune 500, you probably have an entire team dedicated to this, but not all businesses have that opportunity regardless of size. And so what are some of the things that any organization can do? And what are some of the things that anyone in an organization can do regardless of their role or their level? I have continuing the learning. Training has largely been focused on uncomfortable conversations. That's the one that you see most publicly. But there's a lot more to diversity and inclusion than uncomfortable conversations. That's an important training to have and to revisit, because none of us like talking about sensitive topics. And frankly, we're not supposed to. At least that's the way I grew up. I grew up in the business world of, if it ain't business related, don't talk about it. And then the last thing I have here is, what are you curious about? And by that, I mean, what would you like to see as a topic on this series? Okay, now, if it's every other week and there are 52 weeks, I'm embarrassed, I can't do math. Is that 26 weeks? So that means there'll be 26 sessions? I don't know. Anyway, that's the number of topics I'll be able to cover. So let's start with a polling question. And so the first polling question is, I'm asking you personally, if you look back at 2021, what were you focused on in terms of your personal efforts when it comes to diversity and inclusion? So was it increasing your level of awareness and understanding? Was it making sure that you put in some time to attend diversity training or attend different programs? Maybe it was, I just want to do something at work. I want to do more. You did something else. And if that's a something else, go ahead and drop it into the Q&A. I'd love to see what the something else was. So we'll leave this open. It's a little bit longer.
I'm just going to take this moment, Jina, to give everyone the reminder that we leave each poll question open for about 60 seconds or so, and you need to answer 3 of the 4 questions to get CPE credit today. It looks like those answers are coming in. We'll leave this open a little bit longer.
And
close this down.
This is the part where I'm supposed to have my pencil ready so I can write down the responses.
I'll go ahead and close it and I'll share them out for just a second. It looks like 46% are saying education and awareness, followed by something else. We'd love to hear those something else's in the questions panel if you want to share them there. 17% saying getting involved at work, 10% saying participating in D&I programs and events. So now I'll turn it back over to you.
So I see. Thank you, William. William is saying recruiting and hiring. Absolutely. That is such a critical part. In order to create more diverse workforces, we need to bring diverse employees in. So if I can sidebar, let's just start there. When I said the term diverse employees, we hear that word used a lot. Let me go ahead and move this forward. We hear that word used a lot, and people aren't diverse. And so we want to be thoughtful about the language that we use around D&I. And I actually have a presentation I've done last summer, maybe we'll do it again this year, called The Language of Dni. What's the terminology and when do we use it? So we want to recruit people so that the workforce is more diverse, which means we're recruiting the candidates that we're looking to hire and to attract. We just want them to apply for the jobs are more diverse. So what are we talking about here in 2022? I have a couple of things up here on the slide just because these are broad areas to think about. So remote workforce, top left corner here. And we all thought, well, I'll speak for myself. I was hoping we were past sort of the COVID thing after the first round of vaccinations went through and we started to see a decrease in cases, and then it peaked back up again and then it dropped. We're back in another wave. There's no foreseeable future where there's a finish line. And so we hear people talking about the new normal. But when we say the new normal, what do we mean by that? And more organizations are starting to recognize that maybe everybody doesn't have to work at home. Work at the office, and people can work at home. But that poses a whole lot of questions when it comes to diversity and inclusion. So for example, and this is true for a lot of employees today, graduated from college during COVID, you interviewed for your job remotely, you were hired remotely, you were onboarded in a virtual training session, and now you've worked for your employer for, it could be 2 years, and you've never set foot in their office. So what does it feel like to work there? How can you experience, or are you experiencing culture? And so are employees understanding that their experience working here, okay, it used to be my son's bedroom. It's now my office because he doesn't live here anymore. But some people are still working at their dining room table. And that experience working here, how does it match up with the experience my employer wants me to have? And so there's right there, when we talk about the remote workforce, thinking about how employees experience their job, their colleagues, their bosses, their role when they are working from home, or the new term, living at work. So really understanding that is an important aspect of diversity and inclusion. On top of that, are there implications, ramifications, barriers, and challenges that different groups face? So, and when I say different groups, I'm not talking about underrepresented groups. For example, working parents. Working parents might have different barriers than people who don't have children, or I'm a parent, but my kids are grown. So technically I'm a working parent, but I'm not actively a caregiver today. So these terms matter, and the things that we need to think about in terms of diversity and inclusion range. Someone said they were unable to choose the answer on the polling question. So I have a quick question on that. If you can only answer 3 of the polling questions, is that okay? I suppose I shouldn't be asking that question, but I saw that.
It's totally okay, Jina. Yep, we include an extra polling question over what's required. So thanks for letting me know that was in the chat for us.
No worries. Recruiting practices. I think one of the comments that came in already was recruiting as an area of involvement. When we talk about recruiting, there's been this long history, and it's rightly so, that the skills that I had, the background that I had, the school that I went to, the grades that I got, if it worked for me, then it should work for the other candidates. And so we have a tendency to look for candidates that look like us. Now, when we say that, we mean that broadly, but it can also mean that actually literally look like us. And so if I were Caucasian male, I would be looking out at candidates and naturally tend to gravitate toward other Caucasian males. I'm a Black woman, which means as I look at a pool of candidates, I might naturally gravitate toward Black women. And so understanding this bias is important because that's the first step in recruiting and talent. All right, I have another question. I just forgot the name. Beryl, my moderator. Can you hear the dog snoring in the background? Because if you all can hear that, I apologize. But just know that it's not.
It sounded like some sighing.
Okay.
And now that you pointed it out, I was like, oh yeah, that's the dog. It's nice. You have a partner in crime.
I have a partner in crime, yes. So any other strange noises, it's him. But just talking about recruiting, it starts there. How do we attract talent that's more diverse? Do we go to different sources? Do we use different messaging? Do we need to think about how we write our job descriptions differently? Do we need to rethink what the job requirements are? And the answer is all of the above. As well as when candidates walk in the door, do we need to think about who's interviewing? How do we assess their performance on an interview? What are the types of things we need to consider in terms of benefits to attract candidates? Because you can attract someone to your organization in an interview, but then they find out that the benefits don't really match what they need. And so the job is great, but they're going to look elsewhere because of the benefits. And so really looking holistically at all of the things that it takes to identify, invite in for interviews, evaluate, and then make offers to candidates. That's all an important part of recruiting. Recruiting stops the day after onboarding. And employee experience starts the day before onboarding. And so understanding that connection is important. If we go diagonally on the screen all the way to the bottom left, then I have improving retention. And so I just said that recruiting ends the day after onboarding, retention starts the day before. And so what are the things we need to be thinking about so that our employees stay longer? Because we know that turnover is expensive. Estimates from 1 to 1.5%, 1 to 1.5 times salary is the cost of replacing an employee. That is a lot of money. And so it's important to recognize that. Learning and development here, bottom in the center. We've done some training on unconscious bias. There's been a lot of training, as I mentioned earlier, on uncomfortable conversations. But there's so much more to talk about. And training is a level set. There's introductory, there's intermediate, there's advanced, there's ongoing, continuing knowledge. It's just like, as accountants and as CPAs, you have to maintain your continuing education. Or as business leaders, we are constantly providing training to our employees to develop the skills that we value, the skills that are important. And now we know that leading a diverse team requires competencies that we haven't always focused on in the past. And so incorporating that into our learning and development programs is important, which leads right into the point leadership training. And that's a little bit different. There's broad training on fundamental competencies, continuing growth, and awareness in the space of culture, equity, inclusion, diversity. But then we have how do we identify and then develop and promote leaders to essentially develop a succession plan. And then the last one on the screen is diversity strategy, which gets to the how do we do this? And the answer here is there's no perfect way to do it. It's really going to be contextual to the organization, but it's understanding that there are different aspects, there are different approaches, and then there are different approaches to identify priorities, different methodologies to manage a project, and so on. All right, so let me look at the Q&A and see what's been coming in.
Jina, it looks like Carol wanted to let you know that she can't hear the dogs, but they make great companions. And it'd be great if they could do tax returns.
I wish they could. And they're great companions, except some of them stink like mine. But thank you. I appreciate that. All right. So Jeff says, what do you see as the primary obstacle to understanding DEIB? Or sorry, DIEB. I'm going to actually, that's a perfect segue. Let me move to this slide here. So part of the obstacle to understanding it is willingness, because there are those that think this stuff doesn't matter. And anyone who's been the only in the room, it doesn't matter the only. Anyone who's been the only in the room understands that when you aren't part of the majority, there's a little thing that happens inside of you, and it might cause you to hold back. It might cause you to think differently. It might cause you to behave a little differently. You might start to censor the things that you say or do. The other thing we also know is that when we're the ones in the majority, sometimes we forget to be considered the one in the minority. And it's not the intention to be mean. It's not the intention to isolate. It's just human nature. We tend to gravitate toward each other into groups. It's how we are wired. And so that could create blind spots for people who think this stuff doesn't matter. I don't have to do it. There's also been increasing data. Today it's clear that there is in fact a link between diversity and performance. But what we haven't seen, and we're starting to see today, is the continuing thread. So you see here, I've differentiated diversity and inclusion, equity, and belonging. Now the words on the screen here, I have put these together based on how organizations have approached this. So for example, diversity is, we want to say we're committed to it. We want to understand the business case. We need to make sure we're clear on the language, and then we would like to understand the demographics in our organization. So there's the focus on diversity. The focus on inclusion is aligning values to the tenets of diversity and inclusion, to having an inclusive workplace. Gender, diversity, and expression. I talked earlier about it being women is our first focus point. There has been a lot of wonderful work done in this country around advocacy, recognition for the LGBTQ community, which the pinnacle success was the approval by the United States Supreme Court in same-sex marriage is legal. That level of advocacy has been, we've seen that followed up in D&I work as another group that's starting to see we're making progress in. So gender diversity and gender expression has become an area for organizations to focus on. Now, back to Jeff's question about the obstacles then. Some of the work that it takes to move D&I forward requires belief that some of these are issues and barriers. And so there is some blind spot in corporate America and in leadership and business that the experiences we're trying to help organizations understand and address are not the lived experiences of leaders. And most of us, if it's happened to us, we get it. If it's happened to someone else, it depends on how well we appreciate that experience before we can necessarily address it, relate to it, etc. So that's just one of the barriers. And then there's just the bottom line is cost. It costs money to bring in trainers. It costs money to send people to training or out to conferences, to attend classes, study for certificates and degrees. So that's just the hard reality. But by the same token, organizations sometimes ask the minorities in their organization to lead the charge. So they'll reach out to somebody in the LGBTQ community in their organization and say, hey, can you help us better understand your community? And while that's valiant and well-intended, it's now putting the burden on the minority to train the minority about their own barriers and challenges. And that can be very difficult to do and a bit unfair. In terms of equity, the emphasis has been on looking at recruiting practices to try to eliminate as much basis in those practices as possible, looking at employee benefits. For example, a simple example is changing maternity leave to parental leave. Workplace policies. So a really good example of that is the fact that there were policies against working from home and flexible schedules that went right out the window in March of 2020, when almost overnight, every business in the United States went virtual. Those that could. Our essential workers didn't have a choice. And today that still remains the case. But a lot of white collar jobs became work at home jobs. Policies changed instantaneously. I will say the practices changed. The policies might not have changed yet. And so working on those changes is starting to happen. And then under belonging here, I differentiate inclusion and belonging. Inclusion is the intention of an organization to be inclusive. Belonging is what it feels like to work in that organization. So understanding belonging is starting to grow in terms of the work, because that's where we can start to tackle some of the retention issues. What is it going to take for people to feel like they want to stay here because they feel like they're part of the team? All right, so let me see, where are we? I'm looking at the time, and Beryl, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump us to polling question 2. Where has your organization focused its diversity efforts up to this point? So diversity and inclusion, equity, belonging, more than one of these, or you're not really sure.
You know what? I think I just launched a different polling question, Jina.
Oh wait, because I said polling. All right, fine, we're going to do that one. Let's go to that. I'm going to put that on my screen, which is, how are D&I efforts structured in your organization?
Correct. My apologies for getting
That's
the
okay.
wrong question there.
That's okay. Separate strategy, integrated, in lieu of, a formal strategy, just doing initiatives, or they're doing something else.
Looks like those answers are coming in. I'll leave this open for just a little bit longer. See if we can get a few more of you to submit your poll answers. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and close this in 3, 2, and 1. Looks like 34% are saying an integrated strategy. 35% are not sure.
Yeah, I see. And then 15% say separate D&I strategy. I was curious about that, because what we're starting to see is a lot of conversation in this space. A lot of organizations started off thinking, we need to have a separate D&I strategy. And so they started down that route. And that's actually a good place to start for organizations that have the team and the infrastructure to develop and then implement a separate strategy. Other organizations were thinking, we don't have the bandwidth, we don't have enough staff to dedicate to this. Let's just think of a few things we want to do as priorities, and then think of things we can do to execute on those priorities. That's what I've defined here as initiatives. I've had a lot of clients ask me, we're not sure where to get started. We have 5 different things. Where should we start? And my sort of sassy answer is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The answer is yes. And I say that because there's no wrong place to start. Just start. And so here, in terms of getting started, it's really trying to figure out, where are you now? That's really a good baseline, is to understand, how diverse are you? What does it look like in terms of representation in your organization? Are you noticing that diversity varies by level, or diversity varies by department, or diversity varies by role? And so just getting an understanding of that is a good place to start. Or perhaps an organization can ask its employees, how well do you think we're doing on a scale of 1 to 10? Because those perceptions matter. Or organizations can start to ask employees or ask managers, what are your biggest barriers and challenges, and try to address those. So getting started is just a matter of assessing where you are. Then prioritizing. One of the best things to think about is, what is the strategic plan of the organization? And then how does diversity align with that? And then you can start to put together some things that you want to do in an organization in order. Maybe it starts with training. Maybe it starts with redesigning the office workplace. Maybe it starts specifically with recruiting, whatever the case may be. The other thing to think about here is the second bullet, structure. How is your organization? What is the capacity in your organization to manage diversity? Some organizations can actually hire a diversity leader. In some organizations, it's going to be a chief diversity officer. In other organizations, it might be someone in the human resources team. And yet in other organizations, it might be, we develop a D&I committee, and that committee is charged with oversight of whatever the strategy is, and leadership develops the strategy and the priorities. And then the last part here is in terms of progress. How do we do this? Do we have an ongoing sort of portal in the organization where we can see the changes in data in real time? Have we developed a formal reporting process? So on a quarterly basis, we see the diversity numbers, we see the diversity report. Does it go to only leadership, or does it go to the entire organization? So there are a couple of different things that are now being explored by organizations. All of these are questions that organizations are starting to ask so that they can start to decide, if we're going to do this, what does it look like? Or if we want to broaden the work that we're doing, what does it look like? Or if we've put in a lot of work and effort into this space, how can we get a little bit more specialized? Are there areas we can drill down into in order to expand and broaden our efforts? Let me jump backwards to this slide. I'm jumping around here a little bit. So on this slide, I have in here a lot of the different areas that are currently part of the discussion. So multi-generational workforce. We know today that there are 5 generations in the workforce. So in theory, a new hire could be working in the same company as their grandparent and their aunt and uncle and their parents and so on. And so the reality is, when you have a multi-generational workforce, there are different skill sets, there are different needs. Going virtual overnight is a good example. Some might have been more comfortable with the technology than others. So recognizing and how to support this workforce is a different way of looking at diversity and inclusion. It hasn't typically been part of the conversation, but today organizations are realizing that this is absolutely something they need to think about. So how do we do that? Inclusive communication is really understanding the language that organizations are using to speak to clients, to employees, to prospective employees, as they speak as a part of the business community and work with their vendors. And so understanding that language, if you think about it this way, if an organization has to keep saying, we believe in diversity and inclusion and we stand by diversity and inclusion, and that's the only place they talk about it, that doesn't send the same message as, it's obvious from the way you guys are, from the way you guys talk, from the things that you do, that diversity and inclusion matter. It's just baked into the cake, if you will, as opposed to something we do over here. So understanding the messaging and the communication beyond employment applications, or beyond job descriptions, or beyond messaging on the diversity and inclusion statement on the website. Those are important, but looking at it more broadly. I mentioned retention earlier. Reporting and transparency, my little pretend here trying to make a pie chart. We're starting to see trends in organizations issuing transparency reports. This is fantastic. And so one of the things organizations might start doing is internally sharing the real numbers, where we are, where we want to go, how we're doing, and then publicly creating reports that share what is it we're trying to achieve, where are we now, and how are we going to get there, as well as progress, usually in the form of an annual report. So I hope that we're going to see more of those coming out in the future. And then data. There's been some challenges historically collecting data. There are a lot of reasons for that. There's legal concerns and barriers. There are actually laws that prohibit employers from collecting certain types of data. And then there's requirements for how you protect and anonymize data. And depending on the company and the size and the infrastructure, they may or may not have the resources in order to collect new data and be able to adapt either their technology or their resources or their management structures to do that. And so really starting to understand how to manage, collect, maintain, protect data is a conversation we're going to start to see more of that, as well as what data do we collect? Because a lot of information requires self-reporting. You can't mandate somebody to give you information if it's self-reporting. For example, you can't make somebody tell you if they have a disability. If it's an invisible disability, you'll never know unless the employee reveals it to you. If that's the case, then are there alternative ways an organization can incorporate addressing barriers for those with disabilities, even if they don't know if anyone in the organization has them? Because we do know from the data, someone in the organization has one. It's just part of the statistics. And so recognizing that and incorporating that into a diversity strategy is important. So data can inform a lot of that. There is, let me switch to this slide. So I don't remember which survey did we not do. We didn't do the survey about where is your organization. focus?
The poll questions, yeah. Where has your organization focused its diversity efforts up to this
Okay,
point?
so we'll come back to that one in a little bit. I just want to make sure I was
Okay.
clear where we were on the slides. So on this slide, I wanted to bring this up because I talked a little bit about training. And training is something that's always on the D&I radar. And unconscious bias training, uncomfortable conversations training, there's been a lot of that training. There has been, I know for me, a lot of my clients last year, one of the things that I provided training on was being able to articulate the business case, because we know it's in the newspapers, it's in articles, it's in reports, it's in TED Talks. Diversity matters. There's a link between diversity and performance. But how can we make that tactile, tangible to the firm, to the business, to the organization? What does it mean here? Because often we can understand a concept intellectually, but we can't always translate it into what we're seeing day to day. And so being able to understand that business imperative and the business impact has been very important. Now, moving forward, what are we going to do with that? And so what you see here are a number of different topics. For example, go on the right side, leadership competencies. We talked about inclusive leadership is important. Well, what does that mean? What is inclusive leadership? Well, it has to do with being able to, it's cultural awareness and sensitivity. It's being able to foster a team that can collaborate. And collaboration often means we have to be able to sort of duke it out. In order to get to the right answer, we got to be able to hash our way through some uncomfortable answers, maybe the wrong answers, maybe some crazy ideas. How do we do all of that? So that's important. Mindfulness. How do we slow down our thinking so that we can create space between the moment something happens that we either want to or feel the need to react to, and then the reaction itself? You know, a lot of people there's more and more, well, there's studies that say mindfulness, it improves health, it improves brain function, it improves memory. There are a lot of benefits to mindfulness. But in the workplace, there is also data that tells us that leaders who practice mindfulness make more ethical decisions, they make better decisions, they make decisions faster, even though it sounds counterintuitive, it really means slowing down the mind. And so how do we incorporate this into leadership competencies? What about conflict management? We talk about uncomfortable conversations, but what about managing uncomfortable as a manager and as a leader, facilitating those conversations, as well as being able to manage people with different styles? On the left side, I have here fundamentals. Fundamentals are the things that we can continually train on. These subjects are evergreen because you're going to have turnover in your organization. And just talking about unconscious bias, we might have one conversation with everyone. We might have a different conversation with HR. We might have a different conversation with executive leadership. We might have a different conversation with our business sales team. And that's all in the same year. So context matters. Any subject that we know of is complex, and there's nuances and there's alternatives and there's implications. And the same is true with any of these topics. Cultural awareness and sensitivity. I was just having a conversation. Actually, Beryl, I think it might have been with you before we went live, about the importance of heritage months. Like, why do they matter? And are they social, or does business need to acknowledge them? And if so, how does an organization get involved or acknowledge a heritage month? Or participate in societal trends? So there are things to think about here in terms of understanding as an organization the role organizations play as it relates to minority groups, different cultures and ethnicities. Microaggressions are defined as often unintended, usually subtle remarks, behaviors, etc., that convey a negative attitude or that can be hurtful based on a stereotype. And so it's a comment that somebody makes that might insult someone who is Native American because it can seem like a stereotypical, it can seem like, the negative application of a stereotype. And it's often unintended, and it's often, people don't even realize they're doing it. But microaggressions are the day-to-day experience of everyone in the organization. It is a reflection of the culture. And so understanding them and how to respond to them is important, as well as not just the person who might be doing it or the person who might be the recipient of it, but the person who's observing it, the bystander. How do you get involved in that? Because a lot of people, it's not my problem. So, well, they have to deal with it. I don't have to deal with it. Or I'm not the boss, so it's the boss's job. So what is it that each of us can do? Allyship is another important. We're seeing more and more training around allyship. What is it? It's being an advocate and a champion for a group you don't belong to. How does it work? Is it literally saying, I support LGBTQ rights? I support same-sex marriage. Is that allyship? Or is it, I'm going to go to the Out and Equal conference and really learn more about what policies and practices and cultural traditions and things are, that barriers that I wasn't aware of, and bring that knowledge back to my organization? So it's the earlier question I asked about level of involvement. There's level of involvement for each of us individually, and then there's involvement for our roles in our organizations, and then there's our involvement as an organization. And so the learning journey can cover all of those bases. So let me take a moment and pause, because I've gone through a lot, and see where we are, because there are quite a few things. I didn't realize that this was coming in because my Q&A wasn't scrolling, so I apologize for not addressing them.
Jina, there's been lots of good comments just about people saying that they haven't really thought about this or in this way that you're
awesome.
sharing it, which is great. Yeah.
Someone said, I didn't think this stuff mattered until I was the only one that looked like me in the room. That is really important to understand. Let's see. And now my mouse is not behaving. Anthony, thank you. I appreciate your comment that you never thought about any of this. The thing about diversity and inclusion work, and I think this is true for all of us, regardless of whether we're part of the minority or part of the majority. And when I say majority, I mean in that space. So if we're in an organization that is owned by, if it's owned by someone who's from Japan, and so a lot of the employees in the organization are either Japanese or they speak Japanese wherever they come from, and you don't speak Japanese, you are Caucasian. I'm talking about you when I talk about the minority. Now, there are underrepresented groups, and that's a societal classification. And a lot of that harkens back to the Civil Rights Act and some of the laws that followed that, and the language that we use to define different groups. But the very definitions of diversity are also changing, and it varies a lot by generation, which I found to be fascinating. Let's see. What did I see here? Micro invalidations. Oh, we're not going to go there. There's micro assaults, micro insults, micro invalidations. This stuff gets complicated. It's an example of when you start to dig further into a topic, you realize there's a whole lot more to that. You know, in my former life, okay, technically I'm still a CPA. I'm never giving up that license. I have scars from taking the CPA exam back in the day when you had to sit on a table and take a pencil and you couldn't even use calculator. Anybody remember those days? But what was my point? I just forgot what I was going to say. Come on. Oh, yes. So in my career, I ended up specializing in tax. And one of the things I learned about tax law is the more I knew that I didn't know. And I sold my practice in 2012, but one of the things I learned is I didn't appreciate just how much I had come to understand about tax law, because I was really appreciating all of the things I didn't know about tax law at that point, and, you know, having anxiety around that. Well, diversity and inclusion is no different. Any topic is no different. We understand the concepts. As we start to understand the concepts, then we can start to learn the nuances. And then once we start to learn the nuances, we can understand the implications. And then when you understand the implications, you start to circle back to the concept and you see it differently. Or you can see how it applies in different situations. And This is just the way we learn as humans, and diversity and inclusion training is no different. One of the things that I think is important for us to remember, though, I had on that other slide, diversity and inclusion, belonging and equity differentiated. Part of the reason I wanted to do that is because diversity and inclusion, it's become a word, one word, diversity and inclusion. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. But they're 4 completely unique concepts, and each requires something different in order to achieve it. And so being able to understand those terms, the body of work that goes with each of those terms, and then how they interact and connect. Because the impact that we're looking for is a workforce that has just a mix of perspectives and styles and backgrounds and experiences, and incidentally, races and genders. That we're not, there's more categories, races and genders and backgrounds and levels of ability or disability, gender and identity. We want to have no barriers to who's in here. We want to have a lot of people in here with differences that come together to really help us get to some good ideas and good solutions and drive innovation, optimize results, improve the bottom line. And so the goal is to create that organization. Well, that means we have to think about what it feels like to work here. We have to think about whether the policies and the practices are advantageous for some and create barriers for others. Because what we want to do is we want to just strip away as many barriers as we can. Diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging work is about trying to find that balance and that mix. It's not about bringing in people of color, although there are groups that they're part of a set of underrepresented groups who haven't had the same opportunities. And so recognizing those barriers and addressing them is important of diversity and a part of diversity and inclusion. It's not the only thing, but it's an important part of it. It's just looking at it more holistically is the point that I'm making. Somebody said layers of an onion. Yes, Anthony, layers of an onion is right. The more you know, the more you don't know, except the more you know that you don't know. Okay, I'm going to hurt myself if I keep going down that route. There's a little fun game I actually want to play with you all, if you would play along.
Jina, before we do that, can we launch the third poll to stay within our CPE requirements? Great. All right, I'm going to go ahead and launch poll question number 3. This was the one that we were going to launch earlier, but we launched the wrong one. So here's that third question. Where has your organization focused its diversity efforts up to this point? And the answer choices are diversity and inclusion, equity, belonging, more than one of these choices, or not sure.
Carol, that's a great question. I'm going to come back to that one. Ron said I worked too hard for the CPA not to keep it. Oh, you're telling me. I'm going to be CPA whether I like it or not at this point. Right, how are we coming on that? 35% diversity and inclusion. Yeah.
Yep, I'm going to go ahead and close this down in 3, 2, and 1. And 32% are saying more than one of these. So
it's fantastic. And 35% diversity and inclusion, which makes sense because if we're going to talk about the thing about diversity and inclusion work is if we put in a lot of effort to recruit in more minorities, or we bring in people who are different than the majority group that's there, we can be very successful in bringing people in the door. But if we don't think about what it's going to feel like for them when they get there, there's likely to be a higher turnover rate. And the domino effect of that, and what we're starting to see in the data, is that when you have that level of turnover with your new hires, with your diverse talent, it can start impacting other talent in the room, other talent in the organization. And so it's really important to be thoughtful about not just diversity, but inclusion. So I'm happy to see that that's an important focus. Let's see. Now, the comment that was made, let me find it. Carol said, a lot of this seems like a top-down approach. Is there any precedence for it being a bottom-up approach? Not in my current situation, but previously we had a large Latino group that tended to hold positions at the lower level. If there was a model opportunity to encourage them to help educate their peers about the culture, it seemed it would have made a big difference in resolving infighting and cliche type behavior. So, Carol, thank you for that. That is a really good point. And diversity and inclusion work is actually both. Now, from the top-down approach, the reason that approach is important is that we do what the boss says is important. And we model ourselves based on leadership behavior. If leadership acts this way and they're successful, then I'm going to act that way too. It's not explicit. That is implicit. But if leadership says this is important, if leadership puts money toward it, if leadership incorporates diversity into their goals, it's going to get done. Because if leaders are held accountable, the work gets done. On the flip side, it has to be a bottoms-up approach, because leadership can say all they want. But if that's not something I'm committed to, if that's not something I'm worried about, I'm a new hire, I just walked in the door and I don't care about all that stuff. If I don't care, it doesn't matter what leadership is doing, because it's not going to achieve the result. And so it is a mix of both, and a good strategy contemplates that. And then you have to remember the managers are in the middle, because managers are being evaluated by what leadership says is important, but they're managing the people in the organization who might have different understandings and different expectations, or they might expect to see the manifestation and experience that's a result of the diversity strategy a little bit differently than your current management style. So it's complicated in a good way, but it's complicated. Anthony Baker, I love you. You said, how can we work with you? Reach out to me. You can go to my website. At the end of the slides is my contact information. You can ping me on LinkedIn, but I would love to learn more about how I can help different organizations. Let's see. No, I did not pay Anthony to ask me that question, but I appreciate being asked. Oh, Amber said DNI is non-existent. I hope that means in your organization and they're working on it, as opposed to it's not a real thing. I'm not sure what that means, but I'm going to go with the positive on that one.
I believe when that came in, Jina, it was around the poll question that you asked. So I think it was just that it's non-existent in her organization.
Got it. Let's see. Is there anything else? Oh, that was a polling question. So I want to do this quick exercise with everyone. And the reason I want to do this is because a lot of times we talk about unconscious bias, we talk about what organizations are doing. It all boils down to us as individuals, that nothing changes until each of us can change our perspective. And part of changing a perspective requires that you see something. And the reality is, as humans, we have blind spots. There's a great book called Blind Spot. I would recommend that you read it. But there's a fun activity that I have put together. I've done this in my programs. I'm going to need you guys to put eyes on the slides and have your fingers ready for the Q&A. We'll do this at the end as a way to wrap up the program. And then we'll do our last polling question. So I'm going to show you a graph and a box, and it's going to have words on it. And all I want you to do is, I want you to say this out loud. So if you're sitting next to somebody, yes, for a moment, they're going to think you're crazy, but just humor me. I'm going to want you to pull out your watch or something so you can time yourself. And I want you to say out loud the ink color, just the ink color. Don't read the word, just the ink color. I want you to say it out loud and time how long it takes you to do that. All right, I've said a lot of this to give you the time to get your fingers ready and get a timer out. And I'm going to start to show you the slides. I want you to see how long it takes you to say the ink color. Ready? Go. Throw it in the chat if anybody can tell me how long it took them to do that. I'm sorry, in the Q&A. Because it's interesting when you do this, how long, let's see, I'm wondering if my Q&A is coming in. Thank you, Amber clarified it.
There may be a little bit of a delay on this webinar, so it may take everyone just a few seconds to get that in.
Well, I hope that means they can also see this in time. Okay, here they're coming in. Callie was very specific. 6.84 seconds, 7 seconds, 3.7, 1 second, yellow, 10 seconds. So what's interesting is that I had the timer set, it cuts off at 10 seconds. And so I'm going to ask you guys to do this one more time. All right, so we're going to do it again. We're going to play this game again. And again, I want you to time it and tell me how long it takes. All right, you ready? One more time. We're going to do this. Let's go. It's giving me a heart attack, a headache just thinking about it. And the reason I like this exercise is it just goes to show how automatic we think. We do things based on routine, based on habit, based on the experiences we've had, and rightfully so. I mean, you can't work day to day if you have to constantly remember how to pick up a pencil and use it. And so, yeah, everyone is saying here that it took them a lot longer. It's going to take longer because the words don't match the color. The word green was actually in blue ink, and there's a disconnect in the brain. And the fact that our brains fly on autopilot, which is what I call, is the challenge of diversity and inclusion. We have habits, we have experiences, we have backgrounds, we have lessons. There are standards, there are rules, written and unwritten. And all of those things influence the way we work day to day. And in order to drive, to improve diversity by creating cultures that are inclusive and people feel that they belong, and processes that are equitable, that are perceived to be fair by all employees, it's going to require us to be mindful of some of those blind spots and understand that we have to interrupt our autopilot in order to start to drive change. And so that's really the bottom line for me of diversity and inclusion. It's really about getting to that point where we can do that. So I'm going to invite you all to drop into the Q&A any ideas or suggestions for topics that you'd like to see covered this year. Lord knows I have quite a few of them in my mind. And I would love to get your input as I develop that. I also think this is the right time to launch that last polling question, so I can collect these answers and we can do the poll at the same time.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll right now. What was the most valuable part of today's webinar? And answer that question and share any thoughts in the questions panel for Jina.
Can I tell you one of the best things about this question is the number of people who said that the best thing out of it was CPE. I have to say, I really appreciate the honesty, because this stuff only changes when we want to. And sometimes these things are interesting and sometimes we're here for the CPE, and that's fair. Now, some of the ideas I would love to see, I get a copy of the Q&A report, which is why dropping your ideas in the Q&A is very helpful. I'm thinking about things like the questions I get from comments from clients are talking about things like age discrimination, understanding accommodations as it relates to disability. You can interrupt me when you're closing the poll, by the way. How to collect and use diversity data. These are specific topics that we could talk about, just as an example.
All right, that's a good time for me to break in and close this fourth poll down.
And I'm not
all right.
Those responses.
Yep, we're good.
So folks, thank you so much for joining me today. We have 2 minutes left. I didn't see a ton of questions in the Q&A that hadn't already been addressed. So I would invite you all to throw into the Q&A something that you think would be an interesting topic. I have some things on my list, like when we say glass ceiling, what do we mean? Aren't we past that yet? What are the legal barriers to changing policies? Let's talk about mental health and wellness, and what does that mean in the business context, and how does it relate to diversity and inclusion? Or just understanding different groups, digging in a little bit more. When we say Native American, what do we mean? And what are the things that it's important to understand, and how does that what does that have to do with business culture? There are a lot of different topics and conversations we can have. And Chester wants me to talk about fishing. Well, thank you, Chester. I have no idea how to do that. So I can't help you. I can't help you with that. But we can talk about soccer. If you want to ping me on soccer, I'm an Arsenal fan and I'm very depressed right now. So again, thank you all for joining me. I think we're literally at the end of our time.
We are.
Have further questions.
Great. Jina, Anthony said your name should have been an answer option for for our fourth poll, the most valuable part of today. And I agree. Thank you so much for being here with us today, for providing us with this knowledge. And with that, we have come to the conclusion of our webinar. We here at CPA Academy will process your credit later today. That, along with a copy of this webinar and your handouts, will be available in your CPA Academy accounts within 24 hours. And if you look in your email inbox, you will also find the evaluation link for this webinar. We always appreciate hearing your feedback on our sessions. Thanks again to our wonderful presenter, Jina Etienne. We are appreciative of your time and insights, and a warm thanks to all of you in the audience for your participation today as well. Please check the schedule on our website for additional information, and we hope to see you on a future webinar. Have a great day, everyone.